Hey everyone, welcome to Mork Unfiltered. Today's guest has run companies and marathons. For 3 decades, Adam Goldstein has helped shape the modern cruise industry as president and vice chairman of Royal Caribbean. But he didn't just build ships, he launched floating cities, revolutionized guest experiences, and led the company through 9/11, the 2008 crash, and a global pandemic. And imagine a global pandemic for the cruise industry, that must have been something. But what makes Adam different isn't just his business resume. It's his resilience and his focus on purpose and values. This is someone who, at Princeton, read textbooks flat on the floor due to chronic back pain, who became a competitive marathoner with crazy times, who once changed ships mid-ocean just to make it back for his daughter's big moment. Now in Act 2 of his career, he's investing in what matters most, serving on the board of INSEAD, one of the world's top business schools, backing ventures in clean tech, blockchain, and broadband, and shaping national policy through his role with SAFE. Adam Goldstein isn't just navigating the future, he's helping to design it. And today, we explore what it means to build legacy without losing yourself, and why real leadership is more about direction than destination. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Great to be here.
It's great to have you. I want to jump right into kind of like, some of the origins and some of the aspects of your early career. And, it's amazing when I look at your career at Royal Caribbean because, you spent your whole career there, which is like quite remarkable. So my question as we get started is, when you joined Royal Caribbean back in, I think it was the 80s, did you ever imagine staying for 30 years in the company? And what was that journey like?
It was completely unimaginable to stay at any one place for 30. It turned out to be 32 years. It was not even on my radar. I was intrigued. I had a bit of an opportunity to experience the cruise business in the summer of 1987, working for a shipping company in London. And I was intrigued. I'd never thought about that before. And everything seemed kind of new and fresh. It was a very young industry. I don't even think 3 million people took a cruise that year. And when I started to interview for jobs coming out of INSEAD, where I got my MBA, I never talked to anybody about anything without thinking it would be so much more interesting to be in the cruise business. And so when Richard Fain asked me if I would join the company in Miami when I finished school in the summer of 88, I said yes, and just got going. And I don't think anybody, not Richard, not me, not anybody thought it would be the way that it turned out to be, or that we would increase the market by 10x, or that we would build the kind of ships that we eventually built.
That's crazy. I mean, how many people roughly are taking cruises today, ballpark?
Yes, there's a chance that, I think this year it's supposed to be 34 million. And by 2027, there's a chance of it being 40 million. So not only has the industry continued to grow from the early days, but of course it has now recovered in a very positive way from the COVID time. Air was shut down. So to go from essentially zero back to 40 million in a 5 or 6 year period is exceptional.
That is remarkable. And I mean, I live in Miami as well, and I'm fortunate to live actually, I can see all the ships from my window, literally, as they're all lined up. It's crazy when you look at how much technology has changed in that industry. I mean, literally, we're talking about floating cities. But, as you look back over the span of 30 years, what's the most remarkable thing about how this industry has evolved for you?
I think the most remarkable thing, and technology would be one component of this, but by no means the only component, is we were considered a very niche, almost backwater kind of vacation option just for older people, really only for Americans, not for families, in the late 1980s. And we looked to things happening on the land and vacations to mimic things that we saw that were interesting. If you now fast forward almost 40 years, what you see is that cruise ships are in a leadership position in innovation in the cruise industry. And people who deliver vacations on the land look at the ships to see what they can do that's new and interesting and different. That's an incredible transformation. And of course, along the way, it became a prominent family vacation. It became a vacation for people of all ages and coming from all countries. So it's that overall transformation that I had the good fortune and privilege to be a part of. It was a colossal team effort, not only by us at Royal Caribbean and my teammates there, but really by the whole industry to make our mark on the world of vacations.
What you mentioned briefly earlier when we started, around COVID, I mean, everybody in the world experienced COVID, right? Obviously differently. It affected some industries more than others. But when you look at an industry like the cruise industry, I mean, as you said, you guys were basically shut down. How do you navigate and lead through a situation where, everything is essentially shut down? And what was for you the toughest part of facing a crisis like that? I mean, how does an industry overcome a situation like that?
So just to give a little bit of context, Patrick, I actually stopped working at Royal Caribbean on March 2nd, 2020, which was the week that COVID really got going. But I was the chairman of the industry association, and without knowing about COVID, I had agreed to serve out the remainder of my term till December 31st. So the year 2020, I was essentially wholly devoted to working with the staff at the industry association and the leadership of the cruise industry to try to deal with what was confronting us. And we were arguably the most impacted industry in the world because we were completely shut down globally. And that shutdown lasted for between 16 and 18 months and then resumed in a very gradual way. So it took about 3 to 4 years, really until last year, 2024, to achieve the recovery. So we were just put in an extraordinarily difficult place. We didn't feel that we were really able to get a good hearing with authorities around the world to talk through what could be done, at least at the beginning. We had endless rounds of conversation with the United States government and other governments about what procedures could we adopt, how could we interact with our guests and our crew and our suppliers to assure a safe environment with regard to COVID. And it was literally, I mean, for me, from March through December of that year was 300 consecutive days, pretty much all day, every day, trying to find solutions to problems that were unfolding in real time. So it was a once in a lifetime experience, hopefully never to be repeated by anybody. But the industry worked reasonably well together, not perfectly, but reasonably well together. And we eventually, or I should say they eventually emerged intact, not unscathed, but in a position to resume success.
What do you think your biggest takeaway was, leading the organization at that particular juncture? I mean, obviously, as you said, you transitioned out of a formal role, not a more operational role at Royal Caribbean to being kind of like more in an industry role. What was your biggest learning from that? I mean, if there was one thing that you look back and you said, wow, that was kind of just unbelievable. What was your biggest takeaway?
Well, what was unbelievable for us in the industry, especially in leadership, was we almost became for a while the face of COVID-19, our industry. That was an excruciating and unbelievable position to be in. It just so happened that in the beginning, there were very, very few statistics on who had COVID in the world because cruise ships are mandated to keep track of all illnesses on board a ship. Really different than any other industry or any other place. The early statistics were coming from us. And so the association was cruise ships equal COVID. COVID equals cruise ships. And that made it nearly impossible to have a decent or acceptable dialogue with government authorities who were thinking the last thing that they want as they're trying to deal with COVID in their societies is to have to deal with cruise ships. This led to some unbelievable outcomes, like cruise ships essentially acting as taxis or Ubers, taking crew more, in some cases, more than 10,000 miles because they had no other way to get home. Even though every country in the world has signed a convention saying they will always facilitate travel by maritime crew, suddenly nobody would facilitate travel by maritime crew. There were even situations where cruise ships took Filipino employees all the way to the Bay of Manila and were not allowed to disembark their Filipino citizen crew onto the land where they lived because the government was judging it to be better that they stay on board and not come onto the land. I just used that as one horrific example. There were many others. And so to be in a situation where the world suddenly views you in a completely different way than you ever imagined that you would be viewed, and it's on an industry-wide level, it's extraordinary. It was extraordinary to experience that and to try to help recover from that environment.
A lot of our listeners on this podcast, are entrepreneurs. They're people that, by their very nature are very prone to taking risk, but also to managing through incredibly tough times, right? And when you're running a startup, you have to do pivots. Things don't always work out. You run out of money, employees quit, you have all sorts of things. But I mean, that industry, particularly at that time, it seems like it was kind of like probably a new crisis or a new challenge every day. And I'm just wondering, from a leadership perspective, how do you keep people motivated as a leader in a situation like that? How do you keep people focused and just keep them from not freaking out when the world seems to be falling to pieces?
There probably is a certain amount of freaking out, if you will, that's inevitable. But I would say, it certainly was my experience in the industry and at Royal Caribbean, that the loyalty, the fidelity, the commitment of the people to the business to figure out a way to keep it alive, which we also saw after 9/11, which we also saw in the great financial crisis after Lehman Brothers. And then we saw again, only, let's say, exponentially worse after COVID-19, was that people in those crisis situations become amenable to almost any forward approach. In other words, people who in better times or in normal circumstances might be change averse, distant to an idea, tried that before, it doesn't work, those kinds of inputs that you can get, obviously, from a workforce, suddenly become ultra focused on whatever it takes. So as difficult as those situations tend to be, they are also, in certain ways, invigorating in the sense that you get the whole workforce aligned and leaning in the same direction you can only accomplish in a crisis. So that's one of the things that I took from it, was that, how do you achieve leadership in that situation? Well, first of all, you're starting with this kind of head start that everybody just wants to pitch in and do their thing. Everybody's willing to work longer. Everybody's willing to try new things. Everybody's willing to do anything. And so from a leadership point of view, as difficult as the situation may be, that's a godsend that your people are all in. I wanted to say, if I could, one other thing, because I think it's a broader lesson. And I think this is a struggle for entrepreneurs, including the ones that I work with. I see it on a daily, weekly basis, which is, in order to be an entrepreneur, you have to be crazy optimistic about what you're capable of achieving. You have to see the prize, and you're chasing the prize, and you're doing everything that it takes to someday realize that prize. And you don't really want to hear about potential situations that could derail you. You don't really want to contemplate negative circumstances or scenarios that could impede you. And it becomes very, very difficult to see around the corner what might be coming at you that will challenge you, because you're getting up every day thinking, I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
You're not getting up every day thinking, what's going to hose me? I can tell you that in the cruise business, because of the nature of the business, because of ships being out on the big ocean, and things can go wrong, and occasionally do go wrong. There are fires, there are this, there are that. And so we had to drill, and we had to try to imagine the kinds of negative scenarios that we could encounter. But if there's one thing that seems to be universally true of human beings, they never imagine the types of negative scenarios that could occur.
Right.
And so how you balance this sort of extraordinary optimism as an entrepreneur with the realism of all the things that you should be prepared for or should be aware of that could go wrong, that could impede you on your quest, is an incredible, amazing challenge that I have a huge respect for entrepreneurs who are trying to sustain their zeal and be prepared at the same time. I think it's a crazy trick they're trying to pull off.
It is. It is. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's like I've been in 6 startups over the last 25 years, started 2 companies, and the balance is always between, this crazy optimism and belief that anything is possible while also being grounded in reality and trying to prepare for the worst, like you said, right? And sometimes I find that founders can be, generally on one extreme, which is they're overly optimistic, and that is generally good, but ends up creating a whole host of other problems. Yeah, we're going to actually exceed, sales by 25% this quarter because our product's so awesome, or because we think the market is growing so much more quickly than it is. But one question that it does raise, and I'd be curious on your take on this, having worked in both obviously large organizations, but also being an investor in small high growth companies, is what you think the role of purpose is, right? When you think of the purpose of an organization, the purpose of a founder's venture, how important is having a clear sense of why you're doing it vital when you hit a crisis like the whole world faced, in 2020? What's your take on the importance of purpose?
First of all, I believe you need purpose at a deep level to sustain your enthusiasm every day in and day out. So even before we get to crisis, the kind of effort that is required of an entrepreneur to constantly go beyond sort of any boundaries, which I'm sure we'll eventually talk about, my purpose in my life, which we discussed in the past, is to achieve a balance of excellence. It's hard to achieve a balance when what is required of an entrepreneur is an all-out, never-ending effort. And then comes a crisis, right? So here you are, you're giving everything you have to give on a normal basis. Things are happening with your suppliers, with your customers, with your investors, with whatever, and you're dealing with all of the stuff on an everyday basis, and then kaboom. There's a 50% tariff that happens, or a big bank that shuts down, or the market goes down 10% in a few days, and suddenly people who were going to invest in your latest raise are like, oh, I think I'm going to hold off now for a while and see what happens. And this enormous energy that you exert every day now has to go to a higher level that you didn't even know was it possible. How would I go to a higher level than all my energy, right? But I think when I think about the some of the businesses that I'm involved in today, and the purpose that the entrepreneurs had from the beginning and continue to exude. So in the case of the broadband to the home company, it's solving the digital divide. In the case of the water purification company, it's not just addressing industrial water purification needs. It's trying to get the company to the point where we could have a foundation that would deal with water stress problems all around the world, which will be one of the biggest problems as we go through the 21st century. Or the purpose of our software company, which is how do you get companies who do business with each other but are not part of the same group to share information using the technologies that are available today, not be terrible about sharing information with each other, which almost all companies are terrible sharing information with each other. Not because they want to be terrible, but because they don't have or haven't had access to the technologies that would allow that sharing to occur seamlessly. So in each of these cases, the founder or founders are crazy motivated by trying to solve this problem. Or the company the most recent company I've gotten involved with, which wants to take CO2 from an emitted source, combine it with hydrogen from hydrolysis, use electricity from a clean source, and produce methane as a perfect substitute for fossil LNG. I mean, these guys really want to address an aspect of climate change that's enormously important to them. So, I mean, if you look at all entrepreneurial efforts, I'm sure some, depending on your perspective on things, you might look at a venture that somebody has told you about, you read about, and you say, I wonder what the purpose could be. Like, what would motivate somebody to do that? I can only tell you that the ones that I'm involved in, where I'm working with the founders, there's no question that they have a purpose that is driving them forward. And I will say that in every case that I'm affiliated with, the quest has taken longer, and in most cases, much longer than they ever would have believed possible. They start out thinking they have a certain amount of energy that will propel them forward so they realize the holy grail. only to find out that it's like 8 years longer than that.
That's so true. I've seen that so many times, and in my own ventures, I've seen that so many times. But it's like, it sounds like when I hear you speak and the energy and excitement that you have for some of the investments that you've made, it sounds like as an investor, investing in companies that are purpose driven is a big deal for you. Am I right there? Or how important is it for you to get excited about the founder's purpose for doing this crazy venture to begin with?
That kind of purpose is one of, not the only, but one of the critical factors that draws me in. I want to have the opportunity to invest. I want to have enough skin in the game. I'm not looking to be, if I can put it this way, a mere advisor, and I don't mean to disrespect advisors because it's boring, but I want to be involved financially, and I want to be involved somehow in the governance, typically as a board member, right? So it's the combination of identifying a business that I think can have a meaningful impact on society, where the purpose is something that appeals to me, where the purpose is something that clearly is fueling the founder or founders, where I can have skin in the game and affect the business. It's that sort of combination of factors, which I've now come across 6 or 7 times, that draws me in.
Talk to me a little bit about your role at INSEAD, right? So INSEAD, obviously one of the world's top business schools. You were a founding member of the San Francisco Innovation Hub, which was coincidentally opened in 2020. Like, I think we were there together a month before COVID hit. What was a little bit your inspiration and motivation for getting more deeply involved at INSEAD? I mean, obviously you're an MBA, class of '88, if I remember correctly, but how do you see that business school compared to others, and why did you decide to get so involved with the school the way you have so far?
Thank you. I love to talk about it at INSEAD, and I will mention that the opening of the hub in San Francisco was the last business trip that most of us took.
Yeah,
down the world.
I remember that.
When I decided that I wanted to go to business school, I had already gone to 4 years of university and 3 years of law school. I was fortunate from an educational perspective to have spent those 7 years in Ivy League education. And I wasn't particularly interested to spend 2 more years in education to get an MBA. And I already was a Francophile. So when a French friend of mine explained to me that possibly the best business school in the world outside the United States was in France, and for 1 year instead of 2, I was immediately sold. I actually applied to INSEAD and nowhere else. If I hadn't gotten into INSEAD, I wouldn't have gotten my MBA. When I arrived there in the fall of '87 as an American, and there were only 10 Americans out of 165 in my promotion, it was just this startling international atmosphere and environment that was, to me, I can't explain it because I'd hardly been out of the country until then, growing up in America. But it was crazy appealing to me. And as the year unfolded, I became more and more interested in how the business, we now, of course, humbly refer to ourselves as the business school for the world. At the time, it was more understood as the European business school in the late 80s. But I was very, very interested in the relationship between the United States and INSEAD. So interested that Landis Gable, who is an American, still a friend of mine today, also in Maine. I asked him as we came towards the end of the year if I could do an independent elective under his guidance. And I wrote a paper specifically looking at the relationship between INSEAD and the United States. There was about MBA students, executive education, fundraising, faculty, bringing in faculty, most of whom had done their PhDs in the United States, and sort of any other aspect of the relationship between the country where I came from and the school that I'd gone across the ocean to attend. When I finished that project, I was completely hooked. I mean, for me, it wasn't going to be about, oh, I finished my MBA, I will now go on with my life and thank you, INSEAD. It was, I am bonded. And I was incredibly honored. Let's see, INSEAD was like 30 years old almost when I went there. So 20 years later, about 15, 18 years ago, for the 50th anniversary, this school, for some unknown reason, possibly by mistake, said that I was one of the 50 graduates for 50 years. That I was just like, blown away by that recognition. And I started to make friends with the deans and the board members. And I also became rather famously or infamously known as the chief conspirator to try to achieve some type of physical presence for INSEAD in the United States, or at least in the Americas. And we went through a Miami phase where I was based and it didn't work out. And then we went through a New York phase and it didn't work out. And then we ended up in San Francisco and mercifully it worked out. So somewhere along the line, INSEAD was kind enough to ask me if I wanted to join the board. I actually deferred that for a few years because I was so busy at Royal Caribbean. Eventually I said yes, and that has sort of tied in nicely with my post-Royal Caribbean life. I just think it's a very special place, and I think in the fractured world that we're living in, any opportunity to build bridges across nationalities, cultures, and languages is more than needed right now, more than ever. And so there's lots of ways to accomplish that outside the business world. But inside the business world, I think INSEAD is one of the primary vehicles for trying to make the world a better place than what we're experiencing at the moment.
It's an amazing place. I mean, I've been very deeply involved with the school, as you know. My father was on the board for a long time as well. And so, I share your passion and love for the school. I certainly have incredibly fond memories of my time there. There are very deep connections with friends there, and continue to support the Alumni Association here in Miami. The thing that's interesting about education, right, is that, you look at everything that's happening in artificial intelligence, you look at where the world is going. I think you and I, exchanged emails on this at some point. My son, who's graduating high school in 2 weeks from now, has made the decision not to go to college. And for me as a college graduate, and for his mother, that came as a shock. It came as a surprise. Although, as a person, now in hindsight, it doesn't surprise us that much because he's very independent. He's very entrepreneurially minded and self-taught. He's self-teaching himself a whole bunch of things, whether it's, trading or economics or chess or anything else. What do you think the challenge is for schools like INSEAD? What's the challenge for the MBA programs, as artificial intelligence makes, the dissemination of information and the learning and the application of knowledge so much easier? I mean, does the MBA potentially need to change? And how do you see it changing in a world where, AI is automating everything, changing everything, fundamentally disrupting everything?
Even before the advent of ChatGPT and the arrival of, let's say, AI for general consumers as front and center in people's cognizance of what's happening in the world, there were signs of disruption and potential upheaval in education, not only business school education, but most levels of education. Just with the things that were happening in the world, just the smartphone as a tool, even before AI was on the smartphone. So I think what is happening with AI is a dramatic amplification and acceleration of the challenges that most educational institutions face now about what role will they play in the lifetime journey of education. Because it's pretty clear now that education is a lifetime journey. I remember when I finished INSEAD, I literally thought, like, that day I was done. I'm like, I think I actually made my investments professor mad at me because I think I said it out loud, which was maybe not the best exercise of judgment.
You're like, yay, no more studying.
Yeah, I pretty much said, this is it. This is my last day of class of my life. And he was like, oh, come on. And he was right, of course, because what we all now experience is that the opportunity to learn in different ways with different technologies, with different groupings of people is completely never ending. So and one of the, I know I read an article in the last week or two, not the usual article about what are students doing with AI, but it was actually about what are teachers doing with AI, and are teachers over relying on AI to put together their class plans and disseminate information to their class. So there was sort of first phase of worry about whether the students were going to be lazy and take advantage of AI to not really do or learn their work. And now there's articles about teachers are going to be lazy and not really do their work. But I think what I've learned, including a course I'm taking actually through INSEAD right now on AI ventures for people in transition, which I think is a very nice way of saying older people like me, is how do you use these tools to advance your life, not only pedagogically, but in every way, commercially, familially, any way you can think of. And it seems to be my early take on it, and this is where I think there's an enormous challenge for INSEAD, to your question, is you're only bounded by the imagination of the questions that you can ask. You go to a certain level and you might think that's the level that I wanted to go to. And then you're with somebody else and the person you're with says, no, you can ask this, which is like a whole nother layer. And then it doesn't stop. So eventually, I think, with all due respect to AI as a tool, it is still at this point a tool, which is probably a good thing. It's up to us as people, both as individuals and collectively in enterprises and at schools and at boards of schools trying to figure this out, like at INSEAD. How do we leverage these tools to chart a forward path? In the case of MBA, it will have to fit into lifetime journey of education in a new and different way. There will probably be various flavors. There are already more flavors of MBA by far than there were when I started. There are also other types of, masters in financial management, masters in change management, masters in every kind of thing, that are all being slotted into people's lives at the points where they make sense. Your son is probably a very early adopter, hopefully on the leading edge, not the bleeding edge of avoiding college education. But he's onto something. And I don't think we, let's say as a board member of INSEAD, now he's just made a decision not to go to college. He didn't make a decision not to go to MBA, but he's nowhere near that right now, right?
Yeah, I'm still hopeful.
So we as board members of the institution really have to engage with the dean and the other deans of the school and the faculty about what does this mean? Where do we prioritize? How do we raise the funds that are necessary to accomplish our objectives? How do we position INSEAD for future success? Not only against other business schools who are all trying to figure out the same thing at the same time, of course, but against all the alternatives that are out there, of which there are endless and more all the time.
It's an enormous challenge, right? It's like, when I spoke with him and just like when I've observed him and his way of learning, his way of learning is like when I don't know something and I really want to learn that skill, I go on YouTube. I follow all the influencers who have blazed this path before me of something that I want to do. And I start to emulate them, right? And then some of these influencers have courses that you can find on Instagram and you can sign up for mentorship groups. And, he is in these mentorship groups, every evening for like 2 hours listening to, all these traders who have, 7, 8, and 9-figure portfolios. And so he's learning directly from the people that are doing it. Right. So when I had this conversation with him around college, he's like, well, why would I go spend 4 years in college when I can just become a member of these mentorship groups, learn from guys who are actually doing what I want to do, and then just go out and execute? And, honestly, Adam, I didn't have any really good arguments to give him with regards to college, at least. And obviously kids are different. Some people have more clarity on what they want to do. Some people don't. He has a lot more clarity than most, I guess, but it's been interesting to observe him.
So one of the things that I've been mulling over actually ever since you first told me about this, because it really intrigues me, is how does one chart a course as between being an individual, where AI or no AI, you're not changing the fact that there's 24 hours in a day. That is immutable. And so you have 24 hours a day to do whatever you're going to do in that day, versus being part of a collective. And of course, there are businesses, and maybe trading is one of those businesses, where you can be a solo actor and be crazy successful. I mean, it's undeniable. But most businesses are more than one person, right? So how you engage with the world around you and develop purpose that may require more than a solo effort, often will, is something that not only your son, but lots of young people who are faced with all of these opportunities and challenges will need to think through. My nephew is at a very good school. I won't say which one. And he's there. And I've been thinking about this a lot because what I've seen with him, in part because of a family tragedy, for lack of a better word, I think that's an accurate word to describe it, how meaningful it is for him to be with his friends at school. Like, that group of people is his sustenance right now. And to not only does it help, let's say, in that way from a support perspective, but if you're going to be ultimately a leader of a business involving a lot of people, which is a choice, you don't have to be, but in order for the economy to move forward in a good way, it's not going to be totally atomized, right? I mean, there are going to be large enterprises moving on into the future. And how you relate to people, how you learn to lead, how you actually lead, how you work with your peers, there's always a boss, right? I mean, even if you're the CEO, there's a board still above. So how you interact with all these different groupings, not to mention all the external ones, which could be Congress, it could be the media, it could be who knows what. These are things that you can look at YouTube videos, but you've also got to get some real life experience doing these things. And that's where I think the young people are going to be challenged with: how much time do I devote to individual pursuit of learning and excellence, commercial success, versus how much time do I interact with other people for a variety of different purposes?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I am always shocked at how often I start working with founders who are intellectually brilliant, right? And they're building something amazing. They're incredibly hardworking. They're passionate. They're purpose-driven. And yet in some of the soft skills, they are so grossly lacking, right? It's like, I had a conversation with a founder that was, he jumped on the call with me and he was like, well, I think I'm going to fire my co-founder. And I'm like, whoa, let's slow down, right? Time out. Exactly. Time out. And the whole problem behind the situation was essentially that the co-founder was causing a lot of issues, was disrupting meeting, was being very confrontational in meetings with other people. And the founder kept telling me, well, I've given them the feedback, he can't just barge into these meetings or jump in these Zoom calls and get all angry and stuff. And I was like, well, explain to me how you've been giving him the feedback. And he's like, well, I just tell him, what's happening and that he can't do this. And I was like, well, that's not how feedback works, right? How feedback works is, as it's a process, right? You give some context, you try and get the other person's perspectives, you co-create a solution, and then you move to action. And so when I broke down the methodology of feedback to him and taught him the fuel method, and he subsequently went and used it, the conversation was completely different. And he found out that his co-founder was actually really angry and upset because they had not raised money. His co-founder came from a sales background and there was nothing to sell. And so therefore, he's kind of like in this startup trying to justify his existence and find a way to contribute, and he's not finding it, right? So the solution ended up being redoing this guy's job description to help him actually contribute in a meaningful way to the company. That would not have been possible if the guy had not learned how to give proper feedback. And so I think, to your point, that is going to be the biggest challenge I see of a lot of founders who now believe that because of AI, we don't even need teams because we can use agents and we can automate everything and just code at home and we don't need to manage people anymore. So, the world is changing, but those kind of, as I say, the soft skills are actually becoming the hard skills for a lot of people.
I mean, maybe I'm being naive, but I'm skeptical that you can ask ChatGPT, how should I give this feedback to this person? And just say the answer to that person and see if it works well or not. I mean, I don't think, one thing I did used to say, and I would say I learned it through hard experience in early career in management and leadership, was I used to tell people, you may think what you're saying to that person feels like a feather. To them, it feels like an anvil.
Absolutely. That's a great way to put it.
And I gave feedback earlier in my career where I thought the person needs to know this, and I am now going to tell them this.
Good for you.
Seems like they're not figuring this out, and I see it. So it's incumbent upon me to let them know. But that is like, I don't even know if that's like 1% of what is required. to understand their perspective, to understand how do they want feedback to be delivered, how do they deal best with receiving feedback, will they be upset? And it's not like I ever got to a place where I thought like I've made it now. I am now the great feedback giver. I mean, even later in my career when I was in extremely senior positions like president and CEO of Royal Caribbean International. Because one thing that you realize if you are going up the ranks is each time you get promoted, the level of the caliber of individual who is now your direct report goes up exponentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And when you're president and CEO of a large enterprise, your senior vice presidents any day could walk out that door and run an enterprise. Maybe not as big as Royal Caribbean, but could run a business. And of course, inevitably over time, a number of them do. People all over the world running corporations who were in the upper management of Royal Caribbean. So the way you interact with a supervisor when you're a manager has like nothing to do with how you interact with a senior vice president when you're a president.
Very true.
It's
Very true.
endless journey.
Yeah. And that's the beauty of it, right? Is that we're, to your point earlier about, business school and INSEAD and learning, it's like, we're on a journey of lifelong learning, right? I never cease to be surprised every single day, every single week. I have this exercise where what I call morning pages, where every morning I write, I reflect on 5 things I'm grateful for. And then I just free write for a couple of minutes on my day. And I'm always learning new things. And, especially now with, ChatGPT and Perplexity and Riplet and, all these different tools, the learning is incredible. I mean, the rate at which things are changing is mind blowing. I want to switch gears, for a second, because I know we don't have a ton of time left. And there's a couple of things I do really want to cover because it's such an interesting part of your career and of your life. One of the things that struck me, and I was wondering if you would share that with the audience today, when you and I were having lunch, you recounted a moment or a time at Princeton which seemed to have had a big effect on your life and really shape you as the person that you are today and really kind of like give you a lot of grit and a lot of resilience. And that was, the chronic health issues and back issues that you had. How much can you share about, what that was like, how it impacted you, what you took away from that time? Because that story was just so powerful when you shared it with me.
Thank you. I'm completely happy to share these days. For a long time, I didn't, but I don't see any downside these days to talking about the experience that I had because it was central to the life that I eventually built. So I was on crew, I was rowing. I walked on to Princeton Lightweight Crew and I loved it. And I was reasonably good at it. And so sophomore fall, I was able to get a seat in the varsity boat that went to the head of the Charles in Boston. The older guys were defending the championship. So we were in a good position and we won again. And I just couldn't believe it. Like this was a huge breakthrough in my life. And really all I wanted to do was row. Going to class was sort of something to do in between practices. Probably shouldn't have said that. Anyway, on Valentine's Day sophomore year, so now we're in winter practice, I'm jogging down to the boat. I'm into the gym to do a lifting session and my back hurt. And this started a 5-semester long odyssey of really nobody knowing why was I in so much pain. It ruined my crew career. I never was able to row again at college. This is before MRI, so there was no easy way to look inside me and see if anything was going on. Everybody assumed I hurt myself rowing because people think of rowing as being hard on a back. And junior year, as you sort of alluded to, it was really grim. I mean, I could not sit down. I would kneel in the back of a classroom and switch knees, and I would wear out my pants in the knees from that. And as you mentioned, I couldn't sit and study at night either. So that's why I had to lie on the floor with my elbows on the floor and the textbook above my face. And actually the ulnar nerves in my elbows have never been right since that. I was taking crazy amounts of Motrin and other stuff that some of which is now illegal even to give the horses. And I made it through. I don't know really how. I mean, obviously there was a certain amount of determination, but really what there was a huge desire not to miss time with my friends. And I'm achievement oriented. I mean, I went there, I was thinking I would be there for 4 years, and I didn't want to be, I mean, not that I would have loved to be at Princeton for 44 years, but for the purposes of getting a degree, the point was you're there for 4 years, you get a degree, you write a senior thesis. So right in the middle of my senior thesis, between chapters 2 and 3 on why the United States did not go to the 1980 Moscow Olympics, my friends started to ask me, why are you limping? And this led very rapidly to finding out through myelograms, those horrible, gigantic needles that they can stick into you, that I had a tumor filling up my spinal canal for about 5 inches. So it had nothing to do with rowing. It was a freak of nature, and I was becoming paralyzed. So it was taken out. The surgeon from Rutgers did an amazing job, and I went on with my life. I mean, there's lots of other aspects of my back that are relevant, but that was the key part. And so I think from, I didn't like set out, I wouldn't wish that on anybody. I didn't say, hey, I want to have an experience where I build resilience while I'm in college. But I think I came out of that with a self-belief that if I could deal with that, I could deal with just about anything. And, when there were hard times, I mean, it wasn't like I was running around saying, hey, I was almost paralyzed, you can deal with this too. It was just in me, inside of me. It wasn't something discussed with other people. It was just about the determination to make things work, make them happen, deal with the biggest challenges and crises that we faced, whatever it took.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was Nietzsche who once said, that which doesn't kill us makes us stronger.
Yeah, and I can tell you there were times in those 2.5 years where I thought I was dying. Because nobody understood. Like, how could this be happening, and why is it always getting worse? And nobody knows. But the human mind and body are amazing things. Sometimes you go as far as you can go, and that's what life allows. But there's a lot that people can accomplish that's often quite a bit more than they would have imagined that they could do.
It's a really inspiring story, and I want to acknowledge you and thank you for sharing that again with me, and especially with the audience, because they when we share things, kind of at a lunch, it's one thing. When you share it in public, I think it's another, and that takes a certain amount of courage and vulnerability. So I appreciate that. The other reason why I asked that, and this show is really about sharing moments like that. I don't think, I don't want really this show to be just about celebrating success, although obviously you've had a tremendous amount of success, which is awesome as well, is, because there's also, when you look at the facts that, the statistics right now are like 90 million plus jobs are going to vanish over the next couple of years due to, artificial intelligence in some shape or form. There's a strong case to be made that, as human beings, we are going to have to cultivate and nurture resilience as a skill, right? If we're gonna kind of get to the other side of this transformation that we're going to go through as a society. And so kind of like your story there is very inspiring and certainly has shaped you into the person that you are today. What are like one or two takeaways that you would share with the audience on how to cultivate resilience? What should the average person who's out there listening to this, an entrepreneur maybe listening to this, a mid-level executive, who is considering a transition in their career, or somebody who's just struggling maybe with a health issue or a marital issue, what are one or two, I wouldn't say tips or tricks, but what are one or two techniques that you took away from all of your experiences, including this one, that you think can help people become more resilient?
First, I think people are actually more resilient than they often believe that they are. And just like, as you know, I'm a runner now.
Great times, by the way.
Thank you. There are times, like if you're in the second half of a half marathon or a marathon and you're going up a big hill and you're thinking, how am I going to get one foot in front of the other? And then you're trying to tell yourself these sort of mantras or things that keep you going. People have the ability inside their brains to source a lot of support and energy and resilience without even external inputs. So that's the first thing. You look inside, there's more in there than you think. if you had, and then the other thing is, it is kind of putting one foot in front of the other, right? Like if somebody had said, well, you're going to have 2.5 horrible years. You're not really going to be able to enjoy your college experience the way anybody else is able to do. You're going to be in pain all the time. It's like, oh my God, I don't think I can deal with that. But you don't deal with 2.5 years one L at a time. It's one day at a time. Well, if you're a founder, you can have incredible obstacles that keep getting thrown in your path. I've been experiencing this with a number of the founders that I'm working with. But the question is, what can you do today? And if you keep the challenge in bite-sized chunks, like you can only do 24 hours of progress in 24 hours. And if you're sleeping 7 or 8, that leaves you 16 or 17, and you still got to eat and do other things. So you've got a certain amount of time where you can say, I will make progress today. And I'm going to get up again tomorrow and I will make more progress. And I will eventually get there. And if I come to the point where I don't think it's truly not possible to realize my dream, to accomplish this vision, to get this quest done, there's other things in life you can pivot. You know, pivoting happens. Pivoting is not giving up. It's a part, in a certain sense, pivoting is a part of resilience. But it's not like every day you get up and say, oh, this is too hard, I pivot. Right?
I'm done. I'll just pivot again.
Somewhere between I never give up no matter how impossible it is and I pivot every day, there's a balance of resilience and opportunity and challenge that each individual, tries to meet. And I think it's possible to do more than you believe. But the other thing I would say is you can lean on people, especially people that you trust and know. I don't care how successful you are. Like you can have, for example, there are certain people in my life over the years that I would consider my personal board of directors, which is obviously not a term that I am pioneering here. That's a well-known concept, having a personal board of directors. And they can be so helpful. Whether it's saying, continue on course, you can do this. Most of the opportunity is still for you, not against you. Or whether it's somebody saying, what are you thinking? Like, that's just not going to work. You need to think differently about this, or any combination thereof. Don't think you have to do resilience all by yourself. You don't. In fact, YPO, an organization that started because some young guy's father died and left him the business, and nobody had ever told him how to run a business. And then when he was in the top spot, he didn't feel he had anybody to talk to, because you can't have the same conversation with subordinates that you can have with people who are not. And so he started an organization of people in a similar position because he needed people he could talk to. And that's where the Forum of YPO concept came about, right? So I think being imaginative and creative about how you can lean on people and also contribute. It's not just a one-way street. But I'll say one thing that, I reached a certain point in life where I was thinking about doing something full-time again. And I was talking to somebody that I would consider to be like on my personal board of directors. And this is when I had established this portfolio existence that I have today of working with a half a dozen companies and 2 nonprofits and my athletics and stuff, and being able to split my time between Miami and Maine, which is a pretty dynamic duo of places to live, right? So I'm incredibly fortunate. And I was talking to this guy about maybe I'm going to do this. And he said, Adam, wait a minute. What you have is what most people want. And I thought, ooh, I really need to think this through. It means a lot to go back into full-time, all-in, 100% nose to the grindstone work, leadership management or following. And so I think one other aspect I'll say about being resilient is being thoughtful about what your interests are, what is your purpose, and taking the time to chart your path that is right for you. Because your ability to be resilient on a path that's right for you has got to be 10 or 100x your ability to be resilient on a path that's wrong for you. And not only because he said that, but because of the choices that I made, I decided to stick with my portfolio existence. And it's complicated. And my wife deserves an enormous amount of credit for letting this phase of my life, as all previous phases. But, we enjoy what we're doing. We have a purpose. We're able to help people in many different ways, and it allows us to be resilient in whatever ways are required because we believe in it. It's our purpose.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. It's a remarkable story, and I really appreciate you sharing it. I think, those resilience points that you mentioned, really resonated with me. I think that's a really good takeaway for the audience, kind of like realizing that you can do so much more than you think you can, that you're stronger than you are, the baby steps piece. I talk about that in my book, Step Back and Leap, how, even though the book is called Step Back and Leap, that I always tell people that any kind of transformation, whether it's a personal transformation or a industry, company, startup pivot, is actually never done in a single leap. It's a series of very small steps taken over many, many weeks, months, years. I think it was Steph Curry or Kobe Bryant once said, we get praised in public for what we practice in private. And I think, all those small steps over time really speak to that. I want to close with a final question, which, is again came from our lunch conversation, which was very inspiring for me when you talked about it, and which was it's funny but inspiring. So I want to close on something that's, also light and I know dear to your heart. I very much admired you for your ability to stay grounded and balanced as your career progressed and as you succeeded more and more and more in the corporate world. So many people are not able to do that. So many people's marriage, goes to hell in a handbasket. So many people have, dysfunctional relationship with their kids. The story that you told me about changing ships mid-ocean, you've got to share that one, because I do think it speaks to another side of you, which I want to end on, which is, your relationship with your family and your kids and your values as a family person. Could you go there one more time?
So in 2010, couple of things were happening. Number one, Royal Caribbean was introducing Allure of the Seas, the second in the Oasis class of biggest cruise ships ever created in the world. 1 year after Oasis came into service. And also my daughter was a cross-country runner in high school as a freshman. And it so happened that her state meet up near Ocala in northwestern Florida was on, I think, a Saturday. And it was also the middle day of a 2-night introductory cruise that we were introducing Allure of the Seas to travel agents to show off so that they would be motivated to sell cruises on that ship. So how could I be, as president and CEO of the brand, on board the ship doing my job when my daughter was running the state meet and I was determined to be there? And so I thought, well, let's see. Oasis and Allure are going to be positioned. This was sort of unnatural, but we did it for marketing purposes, to have a photo shoot of the two greatest and biggest cruise ships in the world next to each other in the ocean after Oasis left the pier on Saturday afternoon. So Allure would kind of go around, didn't really need to be anywhere, so that it could meet up with Oasis not far off the coast of Miami and do this photo shoot. So I thought, well, if I can get to Oasis, which is leaving with a full set of guests on a regular 7-night cruise, when it gets near Allure, maybe I can somehow get from Oasis to Allure, where I'm supposed to be. So Cheryl and I went to Julie's cross-country meet in the morning in Ocala. I can't remember whether we drove like crazy people, or I should say my wife drove like a crazy person, or we flew. I forget now. But we got back to Miami in time to make it on Oasis. And so the team on board Oasis, the hotel director and his team and the Marine guys, opened up a shell door, a hole in the hull. And we had to climb out of this hole. And you just have no appreciation for the force of the ocean until you're that close to the water level. The current is coming past the ship. The sea tow boat that I had asked to have available for this purpose was bouncing up and down 2 or 3 stories. These guys all know how to do it. I've never done this before, but at some point you have to turn to the ship. It's coming up, 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 up. You grab a pole, shift over to the ladder. Now you're on this bouncing boat. And then it takes you over to a hole in the hull of Allure of the Seas. And when it's coming up, you grab the ladder on the side of the ship and you go in and you think, what have I just done?
That sounds like a scene from a Mission Impossible movie.
The postscript to that was about a couple of weeks later, my phenomenal assistant of 27 years says, I have an invoice here. I don't know what to do with it. I said, what is the invoice for? She said, it's for that sea tow boat that got you from from Oasis to Allure. I said, oh no, how much is it for? She said, I think she said it was for $3,200 or something like that. I'm like, oh no, I can't charge that as a business expense. I have to take that personal. There's no way I could charge the company that kind of money or any kind of money for my desire to see my daughter run and still be on with the travel agents that night. So that was probably the most I ever pushed the envelope for a balance of excellence, or maybe somebody would say an imbalance of excellence.
That's an amazing story. But I love I love what you did, because I think it really speaks to, one of your core values as a family man, right? And as a father. And I think it's just a reminder to all of us out there that no matter how driven or successful in business we are, no matter what we're building, whether it's a startup or, Fortune 500 company, that we are able to balance things if we choose to, right? I think it's a conscious choice to be purpose driven. It's a conscious choice to be values and family driven. So many people say, oh, I can't do it. I'm running a startup. I'm like, yes, you can. You just need to make that call. So Adam, this has been a remarkable conversation. I love your stories. I love your vulnerability. You've had an amazing success. You have an amazing family and balance. And it's a testament to what's possible when you really focus and lead with purpose and resilience. So, just closing, any last words or thoughts, book recommendations or movie recommendations for anybody in the audience before I close out with our outro today?
Well, I'm thinking about the crazy basketball game that happened the other night.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
It relates directly to what you were just saying before about you can't bite everything at once, right? When the Pacers, and I'm neither a Pacers fan nor a Knicks fan. So
it was a crazy game.
I won't inspire any negativity in that regard. They were down 17 points in the fourth quarter. And what they were saying to each other is there's no 17-point basket that we can score.
Right.
We can only come back if we score 1, 2, and 3 points at a time.
Yeah.
And that's sort of code language for resilience.
Absolutely. Baby steps.
They didn't know they were going to win. In fact, when that crazy ball went up in the air, they didn't know it was going to come back down in the basket. And
that was crazy.
2-point shot, they still had to play overtime.
Yeah.
So they didn't know that they were going to win, but they understood that being resilient was going to be second by second by second of effort and trying to make it difficult for the other team while they were trying to come back. And that's something worth keeping in mind, I think, especially for entrepreneurs.
Thank you so much, Adam. Guys, for those of you watching, it's been an incredible show. I hope you really got a lot out of it. There's a lot to learn, a lot of lessons to learn, a lot of possibilities. From the bridge of a cruise ship to the boardroom of INSEAD, from marathon finish to mid-ocean detours for family. I think, Adam, you've reminded us that, purpose, it's not just a title, it's a decision, right? It's a decision to lead with intention, live with values, and show up mile after mile after mile. So, Adam, thank you so much for being on the show again. God bless. Enjoy the rest of the summer. And I look forward to seeing you at INSEAD at the end of June, hopefully.
Thank you very much, Patrick.